So we just finished looking at catabolic and anabolic reactions. And remember that when you break down a larger molecule into smaller molecules in the catabolic reactions, you release energy. They're exergonic reactions. And when you release the energy, that energy is going to be temporarily stored in a molecule called ATP. And when we need to use the energy that's stored in ATP to drive the anabolic reactions, which remember that they require energy, they're endergonic reactions, and we will just chop off one of the phosphate groups on the ATP to release its energy to drive those anabolic reactions so we can take the smaller molecules and make a larger molecule. So ATP is a very important molecule in our cells, so let's talk a little bit more about ATP. So ATP actually stands for adenosine triphosphate. So you can see where they got the name. So we've got the A for adenosine and T for tri, and the P stands for phosphate. So that's where they got the initials ATP. And ATP is the cell's energy currency. So this is what the cell is going to use when it needs energy. It'll just come over to ATP, and that's where it gets its energy from. So as far as what ATP looks like, here's a picture of it. And ATP contains something called adenine, which is right here. And it's what we call an nitrogenous base. And then there's also a ribose, which is in green. And ribose is a type of sugar. And then we've got 3 phosphate groups that are joined together and hooked onto the ribose. So this whole thing makes up ATP. And then to answer a question here, what type of monomer is ATP? So out of our macromolecules, what actually is ATP? So ATP is actually a monomer of RNA. And remember, RNA is a nucleic acid. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, and one of the jobs of RNA is to help make the proteins that the genes code for. So ATP is a monomer of RNA. So I definitely would know what ATP stands for, what its 3 parts are, and that it's a monomer of RNA. So when the cell needs to use ATP for energy, it's going to hydrolyze it. So here's a picture of ATP up here at the top, and notice that we have 3 phosphate groups. So what we're going to do when we hydrolyze the ATP is we're just going to add some water. And remember, lysis means to break or split. So we're just going to chop off one of the phosphate groups, break that covalent bond, and that chemical bond has a lot of energy stored in it. So when we break off that phosphate group, that's going to release a lot of energy that's been stored in the ATP molecule. And then the cell can use that energy that's been released to do whatever work it needs to do. And now what you're left with is ADP. So we've got adenosine diphosphate because we only have 2 phosphate groups left on our ADP molecule. So we started with 3 phosphate groups with ATP, and now we only have 2 phosphate groups left in ADP. And then to answer our question here, is this an endergonic or exergonic reaction? And because we're releasing energy, when we do this, this would be an exergonic reaction. Okay, so looking at our ATP cycle. So we can certainly break off a phosphate group off of ATP, and we get ADP plus a phosphate group. But we just keep remaking the ATP. And then our cells will break apart the ATP, chop off the phosphate group, release the energy, and then they'll remake the ATP again. So this reaction can just go back and forth. So we get this little cycle going on where we chop the phosphate group off the ATP, release its energy, use that energy to do work, and then we can remake the ATP, put some energy in, put that phosphate group back on, and now we have ATP again, and then we can reuse it. So this is kind of an incredible statistic here, but each cell in our human body consumes and regenerates 10 million ATP molecules per second. And so if we add all that up, that's equal to about 100 pounds of ATP used every day. So that's pretty crazy. So it's a lot of ATP. Okay, and then ATP, just remember, is used to do work on our cells. So we can just chop off a phosphate group off the ATP. And now we've got ADP, and we've released some energy here. And maybe we're going to use that to, maybe contract our muscles and maybe, go for a walk or something, move our body. So that could be, mechanical work that we're going to be doing. We could do chemical work. We could do an anabolic reaction. We could take our amino acids, our smaller molecules, and then put them together to make a larger molecule like a protein. And then we could also use the energy released to maybe do some active transport, where we're going to be transporting molecules up their concentration gradient from low to high concentration. So that would require energy as well. And then also notice that we do lose some energy as heat energy, and that's just because no energy conversion is 100% efficient. So remember, that's that second law of thermodynamics.